Death Can Add by Philip Ketchum. His mother was amazed. His father was startled. They could not seem to understand him. They looked at each other, then looked at him, and his father said, "You really mean it? You don't want to go to college?" Oliver shook his head. "I want to go to business school. I want to study accounting." "You want to be a 2-bit bookkeeper for the rest of your life?" "That's where I might have to start," Oliver admitted. Ben Platt appealed to his wife, Olga. What did that high school teacher say about Oliver? "She said he was a brilliant student, particularly in mathematics. She said this was basic to all science, and that if he worked, he could go to the top." Ben pointed at Oliver. "Did you hear that?" "I heard it," Oliver said. "I'll get to the top." "As a bookkeeper?" "I won't always be a bookkeeper. That's just the first step." "What's the second?" "I don't know exactly," Oliver said, "but there will be a second step, and a third, and a fourth. I know what I want to do." Ben Platt scowled, glanced again at his wife and shrugged. "All right, it's your life. But I wouldn't like it, chained to a bookkeeper's stool. I suppose the $15 I gave you for books this morning went on accounting books." "2 books," Oliver said. "The list price of each one was $8.50. "Then I owe you $2. "I was going to pay it out of my allowance." "Nah, I'll pay it," Ben said, and dug into his pocket to get the money. Oliver took it, smiled. Very possibly his smile looked like a smile of appreciation. Actually, he was amused that his father had accepted the list price without questioning it. The 2 books he had bought were second-hand, had cost him $6.50. The profit to him was $10.50. His mother stepped closer, put an arm around his shoulder. "We want you to be happy, Oliver. Your father and I always hoped you would go to college, but if your heart is set on a business career, we want you to try it." "Thanks, Mum," Oliver said. He hugged her, then smiled at his father. "You are wonderful parents." Oliver Platt spent almost 2 years in a business school. He took every course in mathematics, accounting, bookkeeping. He did a lot of outside reading, studying. Then he spent another year in business management, business law, and mathematical theory. By this time he was 22, tall, thin, a little pale but not unattractive. He was a quiet young man with an orderly mind, sharp blue eyes, tight, thin lips. Long before he finished his schooling, he had considered and rejected a number of jobs, and after his classes were ended, he still waited for what he wanted. He finally got it, the job he was looking for, a job as a junior accountant for the Belmont Trust Company. This was an old and respected firm, steeped in tradition and well conditioned with money. Huge funds of money were placed there for careful and modest interest returns. The Belmont Trust Company did not gamble on the market. Securities were bought and sold, but very conservatively. A number of bookkeepers and clerical workers were necessary, but only 3 accountants were listed. Oliver Platt replaced a man who was in his 70s. Both of the other accountants were growing old. In 10 more years. It took only 5 years for Oliver to rise to the position of chief accountant. One of the accountants above him retired, one died, and while 2 more accountants were hired, Oliver had the inside track, had made a good impression, and it was natural to give him the top job. As chief accountant of the Belmont Trust, Oliver was now earning a respectable income. He could afford a respectable apartment, a respectable wife, and a respectable car. He bought 2 of those, the apartment and the car. The choosing of a wife was another matter. The world was filled with beautiful women. To pick what he wanted might take a little time, but of course there was no hurry. He could take his time, experimenting. This was a pleasant diversion. The wining, dining, and entertainment of attractive women was exciting, even if it was a little expensive. Now and then, in his mind, Oliver laughed at his father's obsession that it would be horrible to be chained to a bookkeeper's stool. Definitely, he was not chained. In fact, he was doing very well financially. He had his respectable income and his side income. The side income was what he was appropriating to himself. There was another ugly word to explain what he was doing. It was embezzlement. But it was only called embezzlement if you were caught, and he was not going to be caught. He had worked out an almost foolproof system for plucking the company for which he worked. The next 2 years were delightful years. Oliver met a number of charming women. He took them out, but cautiously, and where he wouldn't be recognised. It would have been foolish to make a splash in society. A chief accountant could not afford it, and he did not ask any of the charming women to marry him. Once or twice he came close to it, but in time he backed off. The right woman, the woman he wanted, just had not shown up yet. He wanted beauty, spirit, and daring. Beauty was everywhere, and sometimes with beauty there was a tinge of spirit. But the third ingredient, daring, was hard to find. Someday he was going to have to run, disappear to some spot halfway around the world. The woman he wanted would have to risk a thing like that. Even an old and traditional firm can find it necessary to recognise its board and its executive staff. During the next year, the Belmont Trust Company went through this process. Oliver Platt was retained as chief accountant, but a new executive vice president was brought in as an administrative director. For possibly 3 months, Oliver worried about the new man. He was in his late 30s, a big, physically powerful man, tall and heavy. He had a nice smile, had good connections. He seemed to know a little about accounting, and if he had looked in the right places, he might have disclosed something unpleasant for Oliver. But he didn't look in the right places, and gradually Oliver stopped worrying. Another year passed, a pleasant year. In succeeding quarters of the year, Oliver devoted himself outside of the office hours to Doris, Velma, Frances, and Glory. They were delightful, but each one grew demanding, and when he would not respond, they passed from his life. At the beginning of the next year, a new girl in the office caught his attention. Leela Graham. She was a stenographer, tall, slender, graceful, with brown hair, brown eyes, a teasing smile. There were weeks when Oliver could have made a date with her, but he didn't. He avoided her eyes, avoided any attention to her. He had made a rule. He thought it a good rule. In order to escape any office complications, he would have no personal relationship with anyone on the staff. Sadly, this put Leela off bounds. But Oliver thought about her, and thought about her, and thought about her. Then one afternoon something happened. something shattering, frightening. It made him almost forget about Leela. The Executive Vice President, Howard Coburn, called him to his office, and in the matter of a few minutes pinned Oliver to the wall. At least it amounted to that. "Platt, how much money do you make?" Coburn asked. 8,500, Oliver said. "But you know that." "Yes, I do," Coburn said. "You earn 8,500. Now, tell me how much you spend." Oliver frowned. He was suddenly uneasy. "I imagine I spend most of it." "You spend that and a great deal more," Coburn said. "At a guess, you have spent more than $20,000 during the past year. 20,000. I wonder where it came from." No, that's impossible," Oliver gasped. "There's been some terrible mistake." "I wouldn't call it that," Coburn said, and he smiled, but there wasn't anything pleasant in the curve of his lips. His eyes had narrowed, hardened. I don't quite know what you mean," Oliver said. "Then let me explain," Coburn said. "I have made a study of you. At a guess, I have followed you in the evening at least a dozen times. You were never alone. You were always accompanied by a young woman, attractive, expensively dressed, and you spent money like water. Before the evening was over, twice I saw you give jewellery to the women who with you, and it was not costume jewellery. It was the real stuff, expensive." Oliver was thoroughly frightened by now, but he still shook his head, muttered a denial. "I haven't finished," Coburn said. "I checked you and your activities out of the office. Then I read and verified the information about you in your personal record. Your parents are not wealthy. You haven't inherited a fortune, so I wonder where your money was coming from. And I found out. For 3 weeks now, I've been working at the office late, studying the books, checking stock certificates. I'll have to admit you are very clever. For 2 weeks I didn't find anything wrong. Possibly it was only by accident that I uncovered what you have been doing. Would it mean anything to you if I mentioned the Von Dimion holdings?" Oliver took a deep breath. The Von Dimion holdings were no longer what they had been, or should have been. Of course, he had such a complete control of the physical properties of a number of accounts that the differences in the records should never have been noticed. It was a sneaky thing Coburn had done, praying into the records, but what Oliver could do about it now he didn't know. "Don't you think I ought to telephone the police?" Coburn asked. Oliver moistened his lips. "No, I'll make it up. How would you make it up?" "I don't know. But if you give me the chance..." "If I give you the chance, in 10 more years the assets of the Belmont Trust will have vanished." "No, I'll tell you what I'm going to do," Coburn said. "I will give you a choice. One is to go to jail, should I telephone the police." "No," Oliver snapped, glaring at Coburn. Coburn's smile had hardened into a grimace, twisted and confident. "The other choice is this. Continue what you are doing. Line your own pockets. And mine. I want 60% of every dollar you take. A full 60%. I will check your work very carefully. If you try to double-cross me, you're finished. I'll call the police." This proposition Coburn had thrown at him was almost as startling as the knowledge that he had been discovered. He had expected to be arrested, to be thrown into jail. It had never occurred to him that there might be an alternative course he could follow. He never would have dreamed that Coburn was dishonest. It was hard to believe him now. He was a stuffy man, lived in a stuffy neighbourhood, had a stuffy wife and stuffy friends. He belonged to several do-gooder committees. In fact, his attitude was almost pious. That he would try anything crooked seemed impossible. "Well, Oliver," Coburn was asking, "how about it?" I don't want to go to jail," Oliver said. "I'm sure you would rather be free," Coburn nodded. "That is easy to admit. But I want you to understand, clearly, the alternative course. I want 60% of every dollar you take. And to make it worthwhile, I want you to double what you are taking. I want to feel the money in my hands. No use being a piker." "We've got to be careful," Oliver said. "No, you have to be careful," Coburn said. "But I know how you work. I can use a little money over the weekend, say about 6,000. That's a take of 10,000. 4,000 would be yours." Oliver frowned. He knew exactly where he could pick up the 10,000. In fact, he already had set up a number of situations ready to be used. He had been saving them for later. His frown grew deeper, heavier. "I'll see what I can do." "Have the money ready by Friday," Coburn said crisply. "But by Friday," Coburn said. "And I want the money in cash. That's all, Oliver. You can go." Oliver took a deep breath, swung around and left Coburn's office. He bumped into Leela Graham on the way to his desk, but he did not even notice her. He did not see her. His world momentarily was in a cataclysmic state in which nothing made sense. It took almost 3 months for Oliver to realise completely the situation into which he had fallen. It was hedged by fear. It smelled of bitterness, and within it were all the properties of a nightmare. He was clipping out more money than was safe. He was still being very careful, but now he had 24 accounts he had to watch and to keep under his own supervision. This took more time. It kept him busy into the evening. It occupied his weekends. He was putting away more and more money, but money itself was not exciting. As for interesting women, he had no opportunity to look for any. He was dead tired when he got back to his apartment, dragging, ready for bed. And of course, he was not sleeping well. Another thing annoyed him. He was taking all the risks. The false entries in his books were in his handwriting. The securities he had sold, unauthorized, he had ordered sold himself. The cheques received he had cashed through the firm, but without recording the transaction. If a very careful audit was made, the entire blame for any errors would land squarely on his shoulders, and Howard Coburn would go free. In no way was Coburn implicated. He took his money in cash, and he took the lion's share of the money. From the way things had worked out, Coburn was the one who was enjoying himself. All the money he wanted, but none of the risks. Oliver was growing to hate Howard Coburn. He hated the man's jovial, friendly attitude around the office. He resented the man's fatuous goodness. He was even angered at the man's occasional symptoms of a hangover and indications that he might have been out on the town. Without doing anything but put his hand out each Friday, he was collecting a modest fortune. Again and again, Oliver tried to figure out how he could escape from the trap he was in, but there was no escape. If he refused to give Coburn any more money, the man would call the police, and he would go to jail. If he ran away, Coburn would report the shortage, and he would become a fugitive. If Coburn should die... Oliver shivered whenever he thought that. Coburn's death. That would be perfect. That would save him. But Coburn looked healthy enough to live forever. As to murder, Oliver could not think of it. To steal was one matter, but to take a man's life was horrible. In the middle of his restless dreaming, one night he woke to a realization of what lay ahead. He was on a one-way road which was leading him to an inevitable destination. There was a definite limit to the amount of money he could steal without being caught. He was very near that point now. When he reached it, the point of recklessness, one of two things would happen. He would be caught and sent to jail, or very possibly, and to protect himself, Howard Coburn would turn him into the police. In any case, prison was just ahead, and not far off. He had been going to the office early, and the next morning, for some reason or other, Leela Graham came in early. She nodded at him, but then frowned and walked to her desk. A tall, slender girl, attractive. Good in her work, too. Efficient, quick-minded. For the past few months, Oliver had been so introspective that he had not found the time to think of anyone else. But there had been occasional lapses when he had looked at Leela and had noticed her as a woman. One, it might be nice to know. He stared at her now, and it occurred to him abruptly that it might not hurt him at all if he ducked his responsibilities for at least one evening and enjoyed himself. A break like this might even clear up his foggy thinking. In the past, he had lived by the hard rule of avoiding office complications, but somehow or other the rule was no longer seemed important. He got up, walked to Leela's desk. "Hello there. Busy this morning?" Her lips twitched. "Have you finally admitted me to be the human race?" "I've been working too hard, and I've been worried too," Oliver admitted. "But I've noticed you. And you know it." She laughed softly. "You are an important man in the office." "Not really. I think you are." This was one of the nearest compliments Oliver had ever received. His weakened ego was suddenly fortified. He straightened just a little, glanced at the clock, realized that at any moment someone else might arrive. Before that happened, he wanted to arrange to see more of this girl, continue their conversation. Instinctively, he lowered his voice. "Doing anything tonight?" She disappointed him. "I have a date." "Break it," Oliver said. "But how can I?" "Say that the chief accountant of your office is an old ogre and he has loaded you up with a lot of work. I know a very nice place where we can go for dinner, a quiet place. The food is wonderful." Leela hesitated. "I don't know that I should go out with you." "Then I'll make it an order," Oliver said, and he grinned. "Be ready by 7. We'll have a drive, cocktails, a delicious dinner. Then we do some dancing, all in the name of good office relationships." Leela looked down, but Oliver could see her lips twitching again. She nodded slowly. If it's an order, of course, I'll have to agree. It might even be nice. He had a wonderful time that evening. Leela was pleasant, attentive, but she didn't hang on his arm. She had a nice laugh. They went to a dozen places. Several were ritzy. 1 or 2 were on the fringe of Skid Row. Leela didn't seem to care about that. Oliver had a feeling she would enjoy herself anywhere. 2 nights later they tried it again. Oliver had even more fun. They went to an amusement park, tried everything there, acted like 2 kids. Then, back in Leela's apartment, listened to chamber music over her hi-fi. Oliver was afraid he was falling in love with her. The next day, however, he was jolted back to reality. Howard Coburn sent for him, motioned to a chair, finished a telephone call to someone, maybe his wife, and then said, "Well, Oliver, we've been doing very well." "We've been going too far and too fast," Oliver said. "It's getting hard to cover up everything." Coburn's smile was irritating, but not his words. "How would you like to get off the hook?" "Get off the hook?" Oliver gasped. "That's it," Coburn said. "I'm going to move on, vanish. Do you know my wife?" "I've seen her. She's a lot worse than she looks. A real millstone. I've had enough. 1 more haul, and I won't bother you any more. But Oliver, next Friday, I want $100,000. $100,000? Yes. That's my price. And I want it next Friday. We would have to dip into our current operating funds. I don't care how you get it, Coburn said. That's your problem. I want $100,000 in cash. Start figuring it out now. Oliver went back to his desk. He was in an almost cataplectic state. But not quite. He could move. In a numb sort of way, he could appreciate what would happen if he dug out $100,000. This would carry him far past the point of recklessness. He would be discovered, arrested, and would go to jail. Leela would be lost to him forever. In fact, his life was already over. There was no way he could escape. But Coburn would escape. No question of that. He would take the money, go somewhere and enjoy himself. In his mind's eye, Oliver could see the man in some South Pacific paradise, surrounded by beautiful women, living like a king, and laughing at the man who had made it all possible, laughing at him. He spent a miserable weekend. Leela was away, visiting her mother, and although Oliver might have found companionship, now that he wanted Leela, he could think of no one else. There was one exception. He could think of Howard Coburn. He could hate him and hate him and hate him. But that did not seem to help. Next Friday afternoon, as usual, he would go into Coburn's office carrying his briefcase. There, away from any other prying eyes, he would substitute his briefcase for Coburn's. They were identical. But in the one he would leave would be Coburn's share of the money he was stealing. And next Friday was the big take. $100,000 for a man who did nothing to help. A leech, a parasite. If he could only put a bomb in the briefcase. A bomb! One that would explode when... Oliver shook his head. He tried to forget the sudden thought which had gripped him. He put it out of his mind, but it came back. It taunted him, teased him, nagged him. He had been good in physics, in chemistry. He was almost sure he could make a bomb, one that would work. He would have to check the possibility of available materials, but he could do that Monday. And he had until next Friday to do what was necessary. A small but powerful bomb in the briefcase he gave Coburn. And at the proper time. A shiver ran over his body, made his skin tingle. He spoke to himself aloud. No, I can't do it, I can't. But even as he was saying that, in his mind, he was building the bomb. Testing in his thoughts just what he would have to do. Monday evening, him and Layla had dinner. He tried to be cheerful. He was not very successful about it. And finally Leela asked him directly what was wrong. When he was evasive, she made a guess. "You're having trouble with Mr. Coburn." He was almost startled. "How did you guess?" She reached for his hand under the table. "I've been watching you. And besides, I'm a clever girl." He frowned at her. "Could I tell you something? In strictest confidence?" "Of course you can." "Coburn has been blackmailing me. Several months ago, I was in financial trouble. I borrowed some money from the company's funds. Very easily, I could have put it back, but before I did, Coburn found out what I had done. He threatened to call the police unless I stole more money from the company funds and gave the money to him. So he's like that, a crook. He ought to be exposed. If I do it, I suffer too, and the chances are he wouldn't be blamed at all." "Did you know he made a pass at me?" "The stinker." "I walked away from him. Next time I'll claw his face." Oliver almost laughed, but then he grew serious. "Coburn wants a big chunk of money, Friday. I've got to get it for him, but before anyone finds out, I'm going to run, disappear. That's not being very brave, but I don't want to go to jail." Her voice was low. "Where are you going?" "Halfway around the world," Oliver said. "Remember I told you I had an inheritance?" "I don't care about that," Leela said. "Are you going away alone, or would you like company?" He looked straight at her. "I'd like you to go with me, but Friday is not far off. We would have to leave directly from the office." She was still holding his hand under the table, and now she squeezed it and nodded. "Friday afternoon? I'll be ready." Oliver straightened. His eyes had brightened. Probably he had never felt better in his life. Layla's offer to go with him was the final determining factor, shaping up in his mind. He would make the bomb, a long, flattened bomb to fit into the bottom of the briefcase, money on the top of it. Too bad they had to waste the money, but that could not be helped. Anyhow, to the money he had saved he would add as much as he could pick up Friday. That was the inheritance money he had mentioned to Leela. No use to tell her everything. The bomb he made was a thing of beauty, shallow, fitted to his briefcase, carefully and accurately timed. Coburn had told him carefully that by 5 o'clock he expected to be at Cloverleaf Airport, where he kept his private plane. By 5:30 he would be in the air and well on his way somewhere. Oliver had set the bomb to explode at exactly 5:30. Shortly after 4 o'clock in the afternoon he picked up the briefcase, glanced at Leela. She was watching him, surreptitiously, but that was natural. In just a few minutes now she would be leaving with him on a long, long journey. Oliver smiled, nodded to her, and headed for Coburn's office. "Good. I've been expecting you," Coburn said. He nodded towards the briefcase. Is it all there? 100,000. It's all there, Oliver said. Want to count it? Coburn reached for the briefcase, looked inside and grinned. It better be there. I'll count it later. I'm waiting for a telephone call. Then I'll clear out. Will you miss me? No, Oliver said honestly. Coburn laughed. I'll miss you, even though I know what you're going to try. Oliver stiffened. What do you mean? You're going to try and set up the books to indicate that I took the money. You will try it, but you won't be able to manage it. As chief accountant, you couldn't have been blind to what was going on, so I'm not worried. I just hope the directors don't ask for an audit after you disappear. They probably will, Coburn said. So get to work, Oliver. Maybe you can save yourself. Oliver turned, left Coburn's office. He stopped at Leela's desk and said, 20 minutes, at the side entrance. I'll be there, Leela said. Oliver was carrying the substitute briefcase. He left it near his desk, walked to the cloakroom, got his hat and coat, and headed for the corridor. 5 minutes later, he was at the nearby garage, where he kept his car. His bags and all his possessions he wanted to keep were in the trunk. 2 of Layla's suitcases and a hat box were there. They would be travelling light, but his pockets were wadded with money. Probably in view of what he had taken for Coburn and for himself, the carefully conservative Beaumont Trust was ready to collapse. He watched the clock, left the garage just in time to meet Leela at the side entrance at precisely 10 minutes to 5. At a guess, Coburn was already on his way to the Cloverleaf Airport. He had said he was waiting for a telephone call, but he was not the kind of person to be patient. Oliver caught a glimpse of Leila, waiting, but then watched ahead, half sure he might see Howard Coburn driving away. He was a little tense. Leela reached his car, opened the door and climbed in. She twisted around and put her handbag and her coat on the back seat. She seemed breathless. Excited? Oliver asked. A little. Her voice was shaky. Why don't you start? Oliver did. He slid his car into the moving traffic, headed for the expressway, and he drove very carefully. This was not a time to run into traffic violations. We'll be able to relax tonight, he mentioned, and he took a quick look at Leela. What are you worried about? I guess I'm just not used to a thing like this. You'll get over it, Oliver said. He was keeping an eye on the car's dashboard clock. It was 5:20. Somewhere by now, probably already airborne, Coburn was headed away. But he wouldn't get far. He only had 10 minutes to live. The clock ticked on. 5:23, 5:25, 5:27. His car moved smoothly down the expressway. The clock pointed to 5:28, 5:29. I didn't mean to do it, Leela said. I mean, in a way, it was an accident. That is. Hold it a minute, Oliver said. He was enjoying this moment. He wouldn't see the explosion, but he could see it in his mind. The crashing sound, the blinding flash. Leela interrupted his thought. I've got to tell you this. I wanted to tell you, but I couldn't. Now, I've got to, for maybe you won't want me to go with you. After you left the office, I went to see Mr. Coburn. I think I killed him. This was such startling news, Oliver could hardly speak. His car weaved towards the edge of the highway. I don't think it was fair for him to take all the money, Leela said. Mr. Coburn was on the telephone when I entered his office. I walked round behind him, and when he hung up the telephone, I hit him over the head with a brass paperweight. I didn't mean to hit him too hard, but I'm afraid I did. It was 5:30 by the car's dashboard clock. 5:30. Oliver wheeled his car to the grass border of the highway and jammed on the brakes. And he was almost shouting, "The briefcase! What did you do with the briefcase?" "Why, it was full of money," Leela said, "so I took it with me. It's in the back of the car. You don't see it because my coat is draped over it. Oliver, what's wrong?" He twisted around, stared into the back seat, and there it was, the briefcase, loaded with money, loaded with death. If he had reached it, hurled it out of the car. He stretched out his hand, but suddenly all about him was sound and flashing colours, an instant of pain, and then nothing.